Behind the Veneer mill at Danforth, a mountain of discarded wood cylinders climbed higher than a man could reach, and in every foreman between the two rivers called them worthless. Yet on a raw March morning, a flatbed wagon hauled 47 of those same cast-offs 4 miles down a rutted county road and unloaded them at a young woman's gate, free of charge. Winnie Ashford stood alone in the creek bottom, her brown coat buttoned to the throat, and looked at the pile the way another woman might look at gold. In the lamplit farmhouse kitchen, her father turned the pages of her notebook in silence, weighing 31 years of thin harvests against 4 words he could not yet say. 3 weeks later, she rose to speak before a hall of seated farmers, her figures ready in her steady hand. From the end of the second row, a gray-headed merchant named Emmett Thorne began to laugh, slow and certain, and let the whole room hear it. She did not flinch, and she did not answer, though the not answering cost her. That night she lit the lamp, opened her book to a clean page, and set her pencil to the paper as the whole county slept. In the spring of 1882, every veneer mill within 30 miles of Calder County ran the same arithmetic at the close of each working day, and the answer never changed. A man fed a log into the lathe, spun it down hard against the blade, and peeled away the broad, clean sheets of veneer that the trade turned into fruit crates and cheese boxes and butter firkins. When the machine had taken all it could take, there remained at the center of the log a hard cylinder of wood that nobody between the two rivers had ever found a use for. A peeler core, the men called it, and they said the words the way you say the name of a nuisance. 6 to 8 inches through the middle, 4 to 8 feet long, dense at the very heart where the grain wound tightest, and worthless by the reckoning of every foreman who had ever tallied a mill's books. You could not saw it into boards, for the diameter was wrong, and the labor cost more than the wood ever returned. You could not split it easily for the stove. You could not sell it, because in the whole history of the trade, no living soul had ever walked into a mill and asked to buy one. So the mills stacked the cores behind their yards, and the stacks climbed through the seasons, and every few months a foreman would stand, looking up at the growing mountain of them, and understand that something would have to be done. And the something always came down to the same thing, which was hauling the cores away at the mill's own expense and paying a man to make them disappear. What the veneer mill at Danforth did about its stacks, beginning in that spring and continuing for years after, was load them onto a flatbed wagon, haul them 4 miles down a rutted county road, and unload them at the gate of a 200-acre farm along Elder Creek, and the mill did it free of charge, and it did it gladly. Now, a man hearing that told plainly might suppose the mill had found some soft place to dump its refuse on an unsuspecting soul, and he would be wrong on every count, and the whole of what follows depends upon his understanding why he is wrong. The mill did not haul those cores to the farm out of meanness, nor out of any trick played on a woman who did not know better. The mill hauled them because that woman had walked into the mill office one afternoon and had asked in plain and level words whether she might take the entire core problem off their hands and out of their yard, and the foreman, a practical gray-headed man named Harlan Boyd, who had spent the better part of a decade trying to give the wretched things away, had looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger offering to carry his heaviest burden downhill for him, and had said yes before she reached the end of her sentence. The woman was named Winifred Ashford, though every soul who knew her called her Winnie, and she was 23 years old that spring, and she is the reason this whole account exists to be told. She stood a little over 5 feet in her boots, brown-haired, plain-dressed, with a stillness about her that people who did not know her mistook for shyness. It was not shyness. It was the particular quiet of a person who has already worked out precisely what she thinks, and is simply waiting for the right moment, and the right listener, to say it aloud. There is a great difference between the two kinds of quiet, though the difference stays invisible until the moment comes when it must show itself. She had grown up on that farm along the creek. She had driven a team since she was small enough that her father had to lift her to the wagon seat. She had spent 2 winters teaching in the one-room schoolhouse out at the county line, boarding with the families of her pupils turn and turn about as country teachers did in those years, and saving very nearly every dollar of her small wage in a tin she kept behind the flour in the pantry. She had worked a single hard season at a basket works over in Kesterton, watching the veneer curl off the lathes and the cores pile up as scrap behind the building, and she had carried away from that season a question that would not leave her be, though she did not yet know it would grow to become the whole of her life. Her father was Josiah Ashford, and he had worked that ground for 31 years, without once bringing in a profit that did not carry the smell of worry underneath it. He grew corn on 160 of the 200 acres, and he grew it the way every man in the county grew it. The same seed and the same method and the same long anxious wait each October to learn whether the year had been worth the diesel of his labor and the wear of his years. The remaining 40 acres ran down along Elder Creek in a low tangle of cottonwood and soft maple, wet ground in the spring, and in 31 years, Josiah had never found a single thing to do with that timber, but let it stand and cut a little of it, now and again for the stove. It was Winnie who came home from her second winter of teaching with a notebook full of figures and a plan built entirely around that useless 40 acres. And the plan began with a question that not one man in the whole of Calder County had ever thought to ask. The question had first come to her in the reading room of the Grange Hall at Alderton, where the farmer's order kept a long shelf of bulletins mailed out from the State Agricultural College over at Fenwick. Most of the men who came to the Grange came for the strong coffee and the stronger talk, and they left the bulletins to gather their dust in peace. Winnie read them. She read all of them, one after another, the way another young woman her age might have read novels borrowed from a circulating library. On a bitter afternoon, in the February before this account begins, she had pulled down a thin gray pamphlet on the properties of small diameter timber, written by a college man named Professor Elias Warwick, and she had read it standing up by the shelf, and then she had read it a second time sitting down at the reading table, and then she had carried it to the tall window to be certain of the failing winter light while she read it through a third time. What the pamphlet said, in dry language plainly meant for mill operators and county surveyors, and not for a farmer's daughter, was this: that the wood standing at the heart of a log is not the same material as the wood grown near the bark, that the veneer lathe, biting from the outside inward, strips away first the young, fast-grown, wide-ringed sapwood, and leaves behind at the very center the oldest and densest and straightest-grained timber the tree ever laid down in all its years of growing. That in certain species, this heartwood cylinder possessed a strength and a fineness of grain that plainly exceeded the sawn dimensional lumber sold at every yard in the state, and that the sole reason no one in the trade made any use of it was that the entire apparatus of that trade, every saw and every rack and every freight rate, had been built around a different size and a different shape, and to rebuild the apparatus cost money, and no man alive wished to be the one to spend it. Winnie had set that pamphlet down flat on the windowsill and stood a long while looking out at the frozen fields going blue with dusk. Then she had turned back and picked it up again and read the part about fence posts. Here is the plain science of the thing, and I will lay it out for you now, because the science is the whole of the argument, and without it the rest is only a story about a stubborn woman, which it is not. A cottonwood tree is a poor thing to make a fence post from, and every farmer in Calder County knew it in his bones and could have told you so before you finished asking. Cottonwood is soft. It drinks water like a sponge left in a bucket. Set it green in the ground and it rots. And 6 years on, 8 at the very most, a man is out in the wet pulling the punky black remains of his fence line and starting the whole weary business over. This was not superstition, and it was not ignorance. It was hard-earned experience, and it was entirely correct as far as it went. But it went only as far as the ordinary wood, the loose, the wide-grained sapwood from near the bark, and that ordinary wood was the only cottonwood any farmer had ever thought to try. The heart of the cottonwood log was another material altogether. tighter of grain, heavier in the hand, far less thirsty. And when the Veneer lathe had finished its work and flung that heartwood cylinder onto the scrap heap with a curse, it had, without any man intending it or noticing it, sorted out and set aside the one part of the entire tree that might actually stand in wet ground and hold. Warwick's bulletin cited a field trial from some years past in which cottonwood heartwood posts, cut from just such discarded cores and treated with a soaking bath of bluestone, which was the plain country name for a solution of copper sulfate that farmers had used to preserve timber and seed grains since before the war, had been set into Midwestern ground and simply left to weather through the seasons. At the time the bulletin went to press, those posts had stood better than 15 years, with no measurable rot at the ground line. And the college men who ran the trial had set down a projected service life of 18 to 25 years, which placed the despised free cottonwood core on level standing with cedars and with treated pine, the two dear materials the entire fencing trade was built upon. And the cedar came freighted down from the far north woods and cost a good deal, Puckin. And the pine came freighted up from the far south and cost a good deal. And the cottonwood cores sat rotting in a useless mountain behind the Danforth mill, and the mill was paying cash money to be rid of every one of them. Winnie carried the whole of this to her father on a Tuesday evening in the middle of March. After the supper things were cleared and the lamp was lit and set to the center of the table. She spread her notebook open before him and laid out, plainly and in order, exactly what she meant to do. She wanted to accept the mill's cores, the whole flood of them, as fast as any wagon could deliver. She wanted a post lathe, and she had already found a used one over at a wagon works that had gone under at Kesterton, a horse sweep rig that a single team could turn in a circle to drive the belt. And the man who held it wanted $84 to let it go. She wanted to treat every finished post in a long trough of bluestone solution, mixed to the exact strength Warwick's bulletin had set down, and she wanted to sell those posts into the fence lines of the county first, and out past the county line after that, into the whole vast and suddenly hungry market that the coming of barbed wire had thrown wide open. For the new wire fencing devoured posts the way a threshing crew devours a noon dinner, and a farmer stringing a single mile of it needed them by the hundred, and needed them again the year after. She had worked every figure by hand at the kitchen table across a week of evenings, and now she showed him the figures. Her cost to turn and treat a single finished post, counting in her own labor and the bluestone and the wear on the machine, came to something a little under 2 cents. The cores themselves cost her precisely nothing, now and forever, for the mills were paying to be rid of them. The wholesale men she had already written to had quoted her prices running from a dime to 15 cents for a plain livestock post, and better than double that for a turned and finished one. She needed capital to begin, and she named the exact sum aloud. She had saved a little over $70 from her teaching wages, and from the butter and eggs she carried in to sell at Alderton. She needed her father to put in the balance, and she needed the use of 8 acres of the creek bottom where the timber stood, level ground close by the water for the treating trough and the drying racks. Josiah Ashford sat at that table a long time and said not one word. He was 54 years old, and he had farmed the same ground since he was a young man of 23 himself, the very age his daughter was now, as she sat across the lamp from him. And he had the particular careful relationship with a new idea that a whole lifetime of thin years builds up in a cautious man. He did not distrust his daughter's notion because he was a fool, for he was not one. He distrusted it because he had watched a great many bright notions come and go across 3 decades and had learned in his own flesh that the cost of a wrong one was never once an abstract thing. It was a note called at the bank. It was a winter of short rations. It was the look on a wife's face across the table in a lean February, when the seed money was gone and the ground still frozen hard. He turned the pages of the notebook slowly, one and then the next. He looked at the columns of figures. He looked a long moment at his daughter's still face across the lamplight, and then he set down his fork and the whole accumulated weight of 31 careful years was, in the four plain words he finally spoke, "I need to think on it." Margaret Ashford had stood with her back to the table through the entire telling, her hands moving in the wash basin at the window, and she had not once turned around. She spoke now without turning, and her voice came low and even and left no room at all in the air around it. "She's right, Josiah. You know she's right. You've known it since she opened that book." The kitchen held very still. Josiah looked at his wife's back at the window, and then he looked down again at the open notebook, and he did not give either of them an answer that night. But a seed, once it has been set down into ground that is ready to hold it, goes on doing its slow work in the dark, whether or not any man stands over it and watches. Now, before we come to what Josiah Ashford decided across those 11 days, you must be made to understand the man named Emmett Thorne, because Emmett Thorne is the other half of everything that follows in this account. And what he did to Winnie Ashford on one particular April evening cannot be weighed or measured until first you have taken the full measure of the man himself. Thorne was 58 years old that spring, and for 22 unbroken years he had sold posts and wire and gates and hinges and staples and every other iron and timber thing that goes into the making of a fence out of a supply house on the south edge of Alderton, and by the plain and settled consensus of the whole county, he was the man you went to see when you were fencing ground. He kept standing accounts with the post jobbers down the rail line. He carried cedar freighted in from the northern woods and treated pine freighted up from the southern mills. And he had built his entire trade across 2 decades upon the simplest proposition a merchant ever leaned on, which was that farmers needed fence posts, and Emmett Thorne had fence posts to sell them. And in 22 years that arrangement had never once required the man to think a single thought past it. Thorne was not a cruel man, and I mean to be fair to him here, because the truth of what happened between him and Winnie Ashford is a harder and a better and a more useful thing than any simple story about a villain and his comeuppance. He was not, by most of the ordinary measures a county uses to weigh a man, an unreasonable one either, but he had stood behind the same counter, selling the same goods to the same weathered faces for running that the outer edge of what he could imagine had quietly, without his ever once noticing the day it had happened, become the very same line as the outer edge of what he already stocked on his shelves. He was the sort of man who held forth at the Grange meetings, not because anyone in the hall had ever elected him to a thing, but because he had been coming longer than nearly anyone else in the room. And he spoke with that flat, comfortable certainty that mere longevity sometimes lends a man, whether or not he has done a single thing to earn the right to it. He had come, over the long, easy years, to mistake the familiar for the true. It is one of the very oldest mistakes there is, and it is made fresh every single day by men who would laugh in your face at the suggestion that they of all people could ever be capable of it. Winnie came to the April Grange meeting because she believed, in good faith, that it was the proper and honest place to lay her plan before the very people it most concerned. She was 23, and she had not yet learned the hard thing that the coming years would teach her at their leisure, which is that the single worst room in all the world in which to introduce a genuinely new idea is precisely the room where the people most deeply invested in the old idea are sitting comfortably with their coffee. She stood up during the open floor, when the ordinary business of the meeting was done, and the members were free to speak their piece, and she explained, briefly and exactly, the thing she was building. She told them about the cores and where they came from, and what they cost her, which was nothing at all. She told them about the heartwood, and why it was a different material, entirely, from the sapwood, that every man in that room had personally watched rot out of his own fence line. She told them about the bluestone treatment, and about the field trial Warwick had documented, and about the service life the college men had projected over their own names and seal. She told them her prices, plain. She spoke perhaps 4 minutes in all, and she was not nervous while she spoke, and she held her notebook open in her hand, though she scarcely once glanced down at it. and when she had said her piece, she sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment, and then, from his customary seat at the end of the second row, Emmett Thorne began to laugh. It was not a short laugh, and it was not a kind one, though neither was it quite an openly cruel one, and that was somehow the worst of it. A cruel laugh at least pays its target, the compliment of taking her seriously enough to wish her real harm. This laugh did not even do that much. This was the laugh of a man so entirely certain of a thing that he found the mere gentle questioning of it comical, actually comical. And he let the laugh run on at its ease, and he let the whole room hear every note of it, so that the room would know, beyond any doubt, where a sensible and experienced man stood on the matter. Cottonwood posts, he said at last, and he shook his gray head and said the two words over again, slower, as though they were the entire punchline of a joke that needed no help from him to land. Now, if that isn't a fine thing to hear on a spring evening, Miss Ashford, I have been selling fence posts in this county for 22 years, and I will tell you a thing for free, seeing as how you seem to have such a fondness for things that come free. In all 22 of those years, not one living soul has ever walked through my door and asked me for a cottonwood post. Not a one. And do you know the reason why that is? She looked back at him steadily and did not answer, which was exactly the right thing to do, though I have no doubt that at 23, in that hall, in front of those faces, the not answering cost her something dear. Because cottonwood rots, he went on, warming now to the fixed attention of the room, spreading his hands. 6 years in the ground, and you are out there pulling it. 8, if the good Lord happens to be smiling on you that particular season. Now your professor, he ran his little trial somewhere else, didn't he? In some other dirt, under some other sky, 1,000 miles from here. This is Calder County ground. Different soil, different water, different everything under heaven. I will give you full credit for the reading you've plainly gone and done. I surely will. It's more than most. But you are going to turn out a great long stack of posts, pretty as you please, and then you are going to stand right there beside them and watch them not sell. Because the folks in this county have been fooled by cottonwood before, in their father's time and their own, and they are not going to be fooled by it again. He settled back into his chair, well satisfied, and all around him a good many of the men were nodding slowly along, for the laugh had reassured them. And a room full of farmers dearly likes to be reassured, and there is a deep and settling comfort in an old certainty that no new fact, however solid, can ever quite match in the moment it is first offered. Let us stop the account right here for a breath and ask a plain question, because it is the very question the whole of what follows turns upon. What did that laugh cost Emmett Thorne? Nothing at all that night. That night, in fact, the laugh bought him something. It bought him the warm and immediate agreement of a whole room full of men who had been buying their posts from him for years, and who found the easy sound of his laughter steadying to their own doubts. What the laugh would cost him came later, and it came slowly, and it came in the end in the shape of every last customer who would one day drive his wagon straight past Thorne's supply house on the south edge of town on his way out to a certain farm along Elder Creek. But all of that was years off yet, and no soul in that hall could see the smallest shadow of it coming, least of all Thorne himself. So what matters just now is not what the laugh finally cost the man. What matters is what the laugh did. In that moment, to the young woman it was aimed squarely at, which was nothing at all that any eye in the room could see, and very nearly everything underneath where no eye could reach. Winnie drove the family team home through the full dark that night, and she did not weep on the road, and she did not curse the man under her breath, and she did not lie awake, rehearsing the 100 clever and cutting things she might have risen up and said to him in front of them all. She got down at the barn and put the horses up for the night and rubbed them down and forked them their hay, and only then did she go inside and light the lamp at the kitchen table and open her notebook to a clean and empty page. At the top of that page, she wrote a single line in her plain, firm hand, and the line was this: Cottonwood rots. The heart of it does not. Run the figures again. And then she sat down and ran The figures again, every last one of them, from the price of 100 weight of bluestone to the wholesale quotes the postmen had sent her. And the figures came out precisely as they had come out every time before, down to the penny, because the figures did not care in the least what Emmett Thorne believed about them. And neither, from that night forward and for the rest of her life, did she. A person can waste half a good life standing in the road arguing with a laugh. She did not intend to waste even the one evening on it. Josiah Ashford thought on his daughter's plan for 11 days. He said nothing further about it in all that time, not at supper and not in the barn. And Winnie did not once press him, for she had learned young that a careful man backed into a corner will only dig his heels the deeper, while that same careful man, left alone with his own thoughts, will sometimes walk himself, in his own time and by his own road, to the very place you had hoped all along he would come to stand. On the morning of the 12th day, he came in from the barn while she was at the stove with the coffee, and without a word, he set a folded bank check on the table at her elbow. It was drawn, for the exact balance she had named across the lamp 11 nights before. He said only that she could have the 8 acres down along the creek, and that if she meant to be running a lathe down there through the spring, she had best get the winter deadfall cleared out of her way, before the ground softened and made the hauling a misery. Then he took his coat down from the peg and went out to see to the stock, and that was the entire whole of it, and it was more than enough. The first wagon load of cores came the very next Tuesday. The Danforth wagon turned in at the gate a little before noon. 47 cylinders of cottonwood, heartwood stacked and chained down flat, each one of them 6 to 8 inches through and running 4 to 8 feet in length, and the driver, a lean, young fellow with pale mill dust, worked deep into the creases of his sunburned neck, climbed down off the seat, and looked at the low creek ground where Winnie stood pointing, and he shook his head in plain, honest wonder that any soul on God's earth had actually asked to have this cursed stuff delivered to her gate, rather than paying good coin to make it vanish. He rolled the cores off the bed one after another, and they came down and struck the ground with a heavy, dull music, wood knocking on wood. And when the bed was empty, he stood a moment surveying the unloaded pile, as though he could not rightly believe his own good fortune in being shut of it. Then he touched his hat brim to her, and turned the team in the yard, and rattled the empty wagon back up the road toward the mill. And Winnie stood alone in the creek bottom, with 47 pieces of what the entire trade, with one voice called garbage. And she looked at them the way a woman looks at the delivered foundation stone of a house she has already built, entire and whole and shining in her mind. The lathe came over from Kesterton the following week, hauled home, broken down into its pieces in the farm wagon, and set up on a bed of squared timbers that Winnie and her father leveled together by eye and by the spirit level down near the water's edge. It was a crude enough machine, that first one, a horse sweep rig with a long boom, that the team walked round and round in a patient circle to drive the belt that spun the work against the tools. And Winnie had copied out the whole of its setup from a borrowed manual she was not allowed to keep, sitting up across 2 full nights at the kitchen table transcribing every last figure and diagram by the lamp before the book had to go back. She turned her first post on a Wednesday morning early that summer, and it was a poor, sad thing, and she knew it for what it was the very instant it came off the machine and into her hands. It ran off center. The taper wandered up its length like a creek, finding its way downhill. One end stood a full quarter-inch fatter than it had any earthly business being. She looked it over a while, turning it slow in her hands and reading its faults, and then she carried it across the clearing and stood it up against a stump, to begin what she was already, without bitterness, thinking of as the reject pile, and she walked back and set up a fresh core and tried the whole thing again. The second post was better than the first. The fourth was better than the second. By the end of that first hard week, the posts coming off the horse sweep lathe were straight and clean, and true to the measure she had set for them, one after another, each near the twin of the last, and she treated them, in the long trough she had built up herself, out of a section of iron culvert, sealed tight at the one end, mixing the bluestone to Warwick's exact strength, and letting each post soak the full count of hours the bulletin called for before she stood it in the ranks to dry and cure in the moving creek bottom air. The work was hard and it was wet, and the bluestone stained the skin of her hands a deep and permanent blue that no amount of scrubbing at the wash basin would ever fully lift out again. And she did that work day upon day upon day through the whole of that first long summer. The ranks of finished cured posts grew steadily along the edge of the timber, grew the very way the mill's own mountain of useless scrap had grown behind Danforth. Except that these posts had somewhere in the world to go, if only she could find the way to persuade that world to send for them. There is one more thing she did in the course of that first summer, and it mattered a great deal more than she could possibly have known while she was doing it, and it was a small, quiet thing that cost her no more than a single afternoon. Along the length of the lane that ran from the county road down to the house, where every soul, coming or going past the farm, would pass close by them 100 times in a year, and never think a thing about it, Winnie set a straight line of her own posts into the ground, not to sell, to watch. She dug every hole herself with the spade and tamped each post home firm with her own hands and the back of the shovel, a straight standing rank of her earliest and roughest and most crooked work. Cottonwood heartwood cured hard in bluestone and set down into honest Calder County ground. And she made herself a plain promise as she tamped the last of them solid, which was that every single spring for as long as she drew breath, she would walk down that line and take each post in her hands and learn whatever new thing it had to teach her. For the post that she sold would go out from her sight forever into other men's fence lines, and their standing or their falling in the years to come would only ever come back to her secondhand as talk carried up the road. But this one line along her own lane she would see with her own two eyes, year upon year, and the ground itself, the one honest judge in the whole affair, would slowly render up its verdict on everything. Emmett Thorne had stood in the Grange Hall and laughed at, and it would render that verdict slowly, in its own time, and it would render it without the smallest mercy for any living soul's opinion of the matter, her own most certainly included. She began to sell that first summer out of the open back of the farm wagon at the Saturday market in the square at Alderton and at the farm sales where the whole county gathered to bid on a failed neighbor's stock and tools. The selling was slow and it was humbling, and it bore very nearly no resemblance at all to the clean, confident columns of figures in her notebook. A fence post is a hard thing to sell to a man who has personally watched cottonwood go soft and black in his own wet ground, and the great most of the men who paused at her wagon that summer paused to argue with her rather than to buy from her. She did not argue back at them. She told them, plainly and without any drummers, shine on it, exactly what the wood was, and exactly where in the log it had come from, and exactly what the bluestone did to it and why, and she let each doubting man heft a post in his own hands and knock it and turn it over and read it for himself. And to those few who did finally buy, she said only that she would be glad and grateful to hear, come the next spring, how the posts had wintered in the ground. She priced them at a plain dime, cheaper than anything Thorne carried on his lot, partly because she had not yet the volume of custom to approach the wholesale men on any better terms, and partly because a low price was the one argument that reached the ear of a doubtful man, after all her patient, careful explaining had failed to move him an inch. The ones who did buy, bought because the posts were cheap, and because this plain-spoken young woman could tell them to their faces, without a single flourish or evasion, exactly what stood inside that post, and exactly what it would do for them in the ground. It was not many of them, that first year. She kept a running tally in the back of her book, and by the close of that first season, she had turned something very near 900 posts off the horse-sweep lathe, and she had sold a little better than 500 of them. And the money that came back to her for the whole summer's labor, counted out coin by coin into the tin behind the flour where her teaching wages had lived before it, came to something under $100. It did not cover the bluestone and the wear on the machine and the $84 of the lathe. And it most certainly did not begin to cover the value of her own long summer of wet and straining labor. By the cold arithmetic of a banker's ledger, that first year was a plain loss. Emmett Thorne, had he somehow gotten a look at that tally, would have laughed his second laugh of the whole affair and counted himself proven right for all time. But Winnie Ashford was not keeping the ledger that a banker would have kept, and she never once had been. She was keeping an altogether different account, in an altogether different book. And in that account, the number that mattered was not the money at all. Not that first year, and not any year after. The number that mattered was the number of men who had bought a post from the back of her wagon that summer, and who would, come the following spring, still have that very post, standing firm and sound in the ground. For a fence post is a thing that makes its own argument for itself, given only time and honest weather. And the argument that it makes cannot be laughed down in a hall, nor reasoned away over coffee, nor freighted in cheaper from a mill 1,000 miles off. It either stands or it does not stand. And every single post she had sold that first summer was, though not one of the men who bought them had, the first idea of it, a small private trial of her own, planted out and scattered across the fence lines of the whole county, every one of them waiting on the same slow and patient verdict that her own line of posts along the lane was waiting on. It was a verdict that only the ground itself and the turning years could ever deliver, and no laugh in any Grange hall in the state could hurry it by a single day or delay it by one. She stood at the edge of the timber on a cool evening, at the very end of that first hard losing season, with the low sun laying its light long across her father's standing corn and the ranks of her own unsold posts, showing pale against the dark, wet line of the creek behind them. And she did not feel in the least like a woman who had spent a whole summer working at a dead loss. She felt like a woman who had gone and planted something into the ground, and who knew exactly what it was she had planted, and who understood, better than any other soul in the whole of Calder County, the one plain thing that Emmett Thorne, for all his easy 22 years, had never once let himself stand still long enough to learn. A man can sell hard against the plain truth for a good long while, if he has the goods on his shelf and the customs at his door and the certainty in his own chest to carry him. But he cannot sell against the truth forever. Sooner or later, in its own time and by its own means, the ground gives up its answer. And the ground, in 100 quiet scattered fence lines across the county and along one straight farm lane, had already begun the slow and patient work of giving up hers. The winter that came down on the heels of that first season came down hard across the whole of Calder County, and Winnie spent it the only way she had ever known to spend a winter, which was working. Though the shape of the work had changed on her, she could not turn a post in the deep cold, for the bluestone would not hold its strength in a trough skinned over with ice, and the horse-sweep boom stood locked and useless in the drifted snow of the creek bottom. So she carried the work indoors and inward into her own head and her own book. She wrote a fresh round of letters to the wholesale men, in a firmer and surer hand than the timid first round, and she wrote as well to the Agricultural College at Fenwick to press a question about the treatment that Warwick's bulletin had left standing unanswered, and she sat long at the kitchen table through the black early evenings with her tally book open before her, doing the one thing that a winter left her free to do, which was to wait on the spring, so that the thawing ground could at last begin to tell her the thing she most needed in all the world to know. Spring came late to the creek bottom that year, and it came wet, and the swollen creek ran high and brown over the low ground for a week, before it grudgingly fell back within its banks. When it had fallen and the lane had firmed up underfoot enough to walk it dry, Winnie went out one gray, still morning with her coat buttoned close to her throat, against the damp, and she walked slow, the line of posts she had set along the drive the summer before. She had told herself all through the long winter that she would not let herself hope too hard over them, that a single winter in the ground proved very nearly nothing on its own, that the whole entire point of the watching line was patience and more patience. She walked it now anyway, with her heart going a good deal faster than she wished it would. The posts stood exactly where she had tamped them home. She took each one in turn in both of her hands and rocked it hard against its footing and felt down low for the give at the ground line. That means the rot has started its quiet work, the soft, heartbreaking sponginess that every farmer in the county knew by feel from a lifetime of cottonwood. She did not find it. Not in the first post, not in the 10th, not in a single one of them down the whole length of the line. They had wintered through as sound and as firm as the day she set them, the blue stone-blued butts gripped tight in the thawing earth, and she stood at the end of the row with her cold, blue-stained hands hanging at her sides, and let herself feel, for one single unguarded moment, and no longer, the true size of what that meant. The greater proof, though, the proof that mattered to the ledger, did not come up out of her own lane. It came up the county road behind a plotting team in the person of a lean, weathered man named Alden Fry, who farmed a hard-quartered section out past the bend of the creek and who had bought 11 posts off the back of her wagon the summer before, more out of neighborly pity, she had strongly suspected at the time, than out of any real faith in the woman or her wood. He climbed down at her gate on a bright morning in early May and stood there a moment, turning his hat slowly around and around in his rough hands, the way a plain man does when he is driven some way to say a thing to you that he is not entirely certain how to begin saying. He had set those 11 posts, he told her at last, into his hog lot, into the very wettest and foulest and most punishing ground he owned on the whole place. Ground that had rotted good oak posts to black punk in under 4 years. He had set them there, he admitted, coloring a little under his weathered brown at the admitting of it, half meaning to prove the whole notion wrong and be done with it. They had come through the whole wet winter, every last one of the 11, without so much as a single soft spot to be found on them. "I'll take 50 more of them off you," he said. And then he looked at her level and steady. "And I will tell you plain and honest, Miss Ashford, I did not ever think I would be the man standing at your gate saying such a thing." Winnie wrote Alden Fry's name down in her book that same evening by the lamp. And she wrote it not into the plain running tally of posts sold, but on a separate page she had lately started keeping at the very back of the book, a page where she set down, one under another, the name of every single man who had doubted her to her face and then come back around to buy. She was not keeping that list out of any spite, though a smaller soul than hers might have, and though the whole county would have forgiven her the spite if she had. She was keeping it because it was data, the truest and hardest data she owned in all the world, and because a reorder in the spring from a man who had first bought only to prove her a fool was worth more to her than any bulletin from any college in the whole nation. It was the ground's own sworn testimony, carried up her lane behind a tired team, and it could not be bought, nor laughed down, nor freighted in cheaper from anywhere on the face of the earth. That was the number that turned the second year, and it turned it quietly, without a sound, the way every single one of the truly important things in this whole account turned. The men who had bought that first summer to be rid of her, or to humor the strange earnest girl, or merely to save the odd dime on a post, came back around through that second spring one after another, not in any sudden flood, but in a steady patient trickle that simply did not stop coming. And each one of them wanted more posts than he had bought the year before, and each one of them had a neighbor or a brother-in-law he happened to mention who might be wanting some himself. She sold clean through everything she had managed to cure over the winter well before the middle of June, and for the first time since the whole business began, she stood down in the creek bottom, looking at her own empty drying racks and understood, with a small, cold thrill, that her trouble in this world was no longer going to be the selling of the posts. Her trouble from here forward was going to be the making of enough of them. She found her first true wholesale account that same busy season, and she found it a full 40 miles off at a large livestock supply operation over at Halloway that fattened beef cattle by the 1,000 head and fenced its lots and runs by the long mile. The buyer there was a woman, which surprised Winnie for a moment, and then, on a breath's reflection, did not surprise her at all. A sharp-eyed graying widow named Ada Corliss, who had run the whole of the supply counter herself since her husband passed, and who had a head for a hard bargain that the traveling drummers who called on her had long since learned to hold in a wary respect. Ada Corliss did not care in the very smallest degree that cottonwood carried a bad name 100 years old. She cared that Winnie's posts came in a full dollar, the 100 under the cedar she had been buying, and that they carried the projected service life of the college behind them in print. And she cared, once Winnie had explained the whole of it to her plainly across the counter, that the supply of free raw material standing behind those posts was a supply that not one other soul in the entire trade had yet had the wit to reach out and seize. She agreed to take 1,500 posts across the coming season at 13 cents the piece, delivered to her yard on a schedule that she herself would set and would hold Winnie hard to. And she shook on the deal across the counter like a man closing on a horse. And that single account was worth more, laid end to end, than the whole of Winnie's first losing year. To fill that account, she had to grow, and to grow it all, she had to take in more ground and more wood and more hands. And the taking of each of the three was its own small, hard crossing to be made. Her father gave over 6 more acres of the creek bottom without much comment on the matter, only walking the new line with her the once of an evening, and remarking, dry, that she would want to keep the tree trough set well back from the high water mark if she did not care to see a spring's work floated off, which was, in the private language of the Ashford kitchen, his way of saying yes and be careful. The wood came to her easier than she had any right on earth to expect, for the Danforth mill was very far from the only mill in the country, with a growing mountain of cursed cores stacked up behind its yard, and word of the strange young woman out on Elder Creek, who would take the whole plague of the stuff away for nothing, and say thank you, for it had traveled up and down the rail line the exact way that news of a free thing always travels, which is fast and far. A cheese box works over at Kesterton began sending her their cores, and then a cooperage that turned out barrel staves. And before long, the loaded wagons were rolling into her gate from 3 directions at once, and every last one of them arrived free of any charge, driven by men visibly relieved to be unloading their trouble onto someone else's ground, so that the raw material, which was the whole entire foundation of her growing trade, cost her, exactly as it had cost her from the very first Tuesday, precisely and eternally nothing. The hands were the hard part of the 3, for a post lathe wants a man who can be trusted alone with it and with the tools and the count, and such men were not thick on the ground in that country. She found hers by pure luck and by the plain misfortune of another, in the person of a broad, quiet man named Amos Beckett, who came walking up her lane on foot one hot August afternoon, with a bindle slung over his shoulder, and asked her, cap in hand, whether she had any work for a man who knew a lathe. He had run the big Veneer lathe at Danforth for 9 years, he told her, until the mill cut back its second shift in a slow season and let him go with a week's wages and a handshake for his trouble. And he had heard, everyone up and down the line had heard, that the Ashford girl out on the creek was turning the very self-same cores he used to peel and pile, and he had figured to himself that a man who knew a lathe well from the peeling side of it might just come to know it from the turning side too. Winnie put him on the horse sweep that same afternoon, without ceremony, to see plainly what he could do, and she stood back a little and watched him set a core, and true it up, and bring the finished post off clean and straight in, a little better than half the time it took her own hands to do it. And she understood, inside of 10 watching minutes, that she was looking at the finest lathe hand she would ever in her life employ. In a field, it was true that at that particular moment in history numbered exactly and only 2 souls. Amos Beckett had a way with the singing machine that could never have been taught to a man who lacked it. A deep sense living in his broad hands for the moment a core was running true, and the moment it began to fight him. And he had one thing more besides, a thing that mattered a great deal more to Winnie than his speed, which was that he plainly did not think the work beneath him, nor the young woman who paid him beneath his notice or his respect. He fell into the daily rhythm of the creek bottom place, as though he had always been some part of it. And he stayed on through that season and the next season, and for a long good stretch of years after that. And though he was a quiet man who spent his words the way a poor man spends his coins, there came one evening early in his time there when he set down a finished post on the drying rack and stood looking out at the long pale ranks of them going gold in the low sun, and said, mostly to himself and the evening, that he had spent 9 years of his one life turning the good wood into thin veneer and heaving the best wood in the whole log onto the scrap heap with the rest of the trash, and it had taken a country school teacher to walk down and tell the whole trade which was rightly which. Winnie did not answer the man. Some hard true things a person does far better to let stand where they fall. That second year closed with the whole operation, grown out well past anything she could have honestly promised her father across the lamp 2 springs before. She had turned better than 1,800 posts, and she had sold very near all of them. And the money that came back for the year was more than 8 times over what the first hard year had returned. And after every last cost was counted straight, the machine and the bluestone, and the wages of her hands, and the small, honest lease, she now insisted upon paying her own father for the use of his creek acres. There stood a clear profit at the bottom of the page that even a tight bank man would have looked at and called by its right name. It was not a fortune. It was the beginning of one, which is a different and a far better and a far more durable thing than a fortune, because a fortune can be lost entire in a single bad season, while a true beginning, rightly and patiently tended, only compounds. Emmett Thorne, all through those first 2 years, went on doing precisely and exactly what he had always done, which was to order his cedar down from the northern woods and his treated pine up from the southern mills and sell the both of them off his lot at prices that had held so steady for so long that the county had quite forgotten to question them at all. He was not worried about the girl out on Elder Creek. He mentioned her now and again down at the Grange in the easy offhand way that a settled man mentions a thing he considers long since decided and mildly amusing. Besides, that Ashford girl and her cottonwood notions, and the room would generally allow among themselves that it was a curious enough little experiment, and would no doubt come in time to nothing much. And Thorne believed that, and here is the part of it that matters most to understand. He no longer believed it out of any spite or wounded pride. He believed it because the numbers that he himself could see, his own steady sales and his own faithful custom and his own full ledger at the year's end, had not yet shown him one single solitary reason to believe otherwise. The numbers that would have changed the man's mind in an afternoon were not numbers that Emmett Thorne could see from where he stood. They were written down small in a tally book, kept behind the flour in a farmhouse kitchen 4 miles out of town, and they were driven down deep into the wet fence lines of men who had quietly stopped coming to his counter without ever once telling him the reason why. And a man cannot be moved by evidence that he has arranged the whole of his life so as never to have to look at. The third year was the year the whole thing changed its scale entire, and it changed because Winnie found the one market she had never once thought to go looking for, and, in the end, it found her fully as much as she found it. A man drove up her lane that spring in a light and well-kept buggy, no farmer by the cut of his town coat, and he stepped down and introduced himself as a buyer for a vineyard operation over at Millbrook, where the warm sandy ridges standing above the river had proven across the past decade to grow the Native American grape as sweet and as heavy as any ground in the whole state. He had a proposition for her, he said, that had very little to do with fence posts, as she had been thinking of them. The vineyards trained their long rows of vines up on wire trellises, and those trellises stood on posts by the many thousand, and the posts they had been buying and setting, rough-sawn things quick to rot, in the worked and watered and endlessly cultivated soil of the vineyard rows, were a constant grinding expense and a constant seasonal vexation to every grower on the ridge. He had heard, he said, through Ada Corliss over at Halloway, of a certain cottonwood post that somehow did not rot. What he had driven out to learn was whether she could turn him such a post that was not only sound in the wet ground, but also handsome to the eye, a properly finished post with a smooth, clean taper and a neat chamfered head, because the vineyards were selling their wine now to the fine houses in the cities, and the buyers who came up from those cities walked the rows on a Sunday with their parasols, and a vineyard that meant to charge a fine price did not care to have its picturesque rows held up out of the earth by anything that looked as though it belonged in a backlot hog pen. Winnie understood the whole of the man's proposition in the time it took him to lay it out to her. The wood was the very same wood, free to her as it had always been and always would be. But the post he was describing to her was a different article of steel entirely, worth 3 and 4 times over the price of a plain livestock post, and the whole of the difference in cost to her was only a little more labor and a little more patient time standing at the lathe. She told him plainly that she could turn him exactly what he wanted, and she turned him a finished sample that same week. And when the buyer came back and saw it and hefted it and ran his thumb along its clean chamfered head, he ordered 1,800 of them from her on the spot, turned and chamfered and finished to the sample. And that single order, at the price the man named without her having to haggle him up, was worth more than any one thing she had sold across the whole of 3 years. She had to run the lathe a full 6 days in the week to fill it, and she took on 2 more men off the strength of it alone. And the finished posts went out to Millbrook load by load all through that summer, and when the payment for the whole of the order came back to her at last, and she held the bank draft in her 2 blue-stained hands at the kitchen table, it was a sum she had to read over twice in the lamplight to be entirely certain she had counted the figures right. She sat with that draft a good long while before she carried it in to the bank at Alderton, long enough that her father came in from the field at the dinner hour and found her still sitting there with it. He looked over her shoulder at the figure written across it, and he was quiet in the particular way. He was always quiet about the things that moved him deepest. And then he pulled out the chair across the table from her and sat himself down and looked at the draft some more, as though the number inked upon it might somehow change, if only he studied it hard and long enough. "You'll want to raise the roof on that lathe shed," he said to her at last. "You can't rightly run 3 machines under the low roof you've got down there." She did not look up from the draft. "I had the timber for it cut and stacked to season back in April." He nodded to that, slow, and something moved briefly at the very corner of his mouth that on another and an easier man would have unfolded into a plain smile. He got up from the table and took a coat down and went back out to the corn, and that was the entire whole of the conversation between them. And it was, she knew, the very closest thing to open praise that Josiah Ashford had spoken aloud in all the 30-odd years his daughter had known him. And she understood it clear for exactly what it was. And it was enough for her, and more than enough. There are families in this world in which every last thing is said aloud and very little of it is truly meant, and there are other families in which almost nothing at all is ever said aloud, and every silent thing is meant down to the bone. And Winnie Ashford had been raised up in the second kind, and she would not have traded her raising for the other for any sum of money on the draft or off it. That was the year she stopped thinking of the whole operation as a thing that she merely did, and began thinking of it instead as a thing that plainly and permanently was, a going concern with a name of its own, and so she gave it one, plain and unadorned as everything else about her, the Ashford Post Company, and she had the name lettered clean and black on the side of the delivery wagon, and printed across the head of the bills of sale she now sent out to her accounts. She was 25 years old. She had not gone back to stand up and say a single word at the Grange since the April night Emmett Thorne had laughed her down in front of the county. And she had no intention on earth of going back, for she had learned in the years between The answer to a public laugh is never once a better and a cleverer speech. The answer to a laugh is a fence line 4 years in the wet ground that has not rotted, and a delivery wagon with your own name lettered plain down its side, and a ledger that closes hard in the black at the turn of the year. And she was building all three of those answers at once with her own blue hands, and she was letting the three of them do the whole of her talking for her. And they talked every passing season a great deal more persuasively than she could ever have stood up and talked for herself in any hall in the state. But a business built up on one good year is not at all the same thing as a business built to stand and last. And Winnie knew the hard difference between the two better than anyone. And she had already begun, even in the first warm flush of the vineyard money, to see clearly the one true weakness standing in the middle of everything she had made. Her posts were good. The steady reorders proved it every spring, and Warwick's aging trial backed it, and the ground along her own lane swore to it fresh each year. Yet she had only her own plain word and a decade-old college pamphlet to lay before a large buyer who did not know her from any other soul. And there were larger buyers swimming into her view now, far larger than any she had yet served, who would never in this world buy by the 10,000 on the strength of a young woman's word and an old man's pamphlet. The vineyard man had bought on Ada Corliss's personal say-so. The next man passed him, and the man past that one. The men who bought their posts by the full 10,000 and not by the 100 would want a great deal firmer ground under their boots before they signed. Proof that a college or a railroad or a state could put its own name behind. And Winnie did not have that proof in her hand. And so she set herself, all through that third winter, to the hard business of going and getting it. She wrote to Fenwick, to Professor Warwick himself, a longer and more careful letter than any she had yet set her hand to. She laid out for him, in order, the whole of what she had built out on the creek, and exactly what her posts had done and not done down in the ground across 4 full seasons now. And she made the man an offer that was in its true heart a request dressed up in an offer's Sunday coat. She would supply the college, entirely free of any charge, with as many of her posts as its people cared to take and test, of any age and any treatment strength they might care to specify, and she would throw open the whole of her operation to their closest examination. The treatment strengths and the soak times, and the moisture measures, and every last figure and method she used, and in return for the whole of it she asked only this one thing, that they set down in honest print whatever it was they found, be it good or be it ruinous. If her posts failed the hard tests of the college, she wanted to be the first to know it, and to know it before she sold one single post more to any trusting man. If they passed, she wanted that passing set down plain and permanent over the college's own name and seal, in a place where a hard-headed railroad man could read it and be made to believe it. It was a bold letter for a farmer's daughter to sit down and send off to a state professor, and she was some long, anxious weeks in the getting of any answer back, and the weeks were not comfortable ones to live through. For she had staked something real, and something dear in the sending of it, something she could not easily call back once it was gone down the road in the mail. When Professor Warwick's reply did at last come, it was cautious in the particular, careful way of a scientific man, promising her nothing under heaven beyond a fair and an honest look. But a fair and an honest look was the whole of the things she had asked the man for, and she read the short letter through twice standing at the window, and then she walked straight out to the lathe shed where Amos Beckett stood working, and told him they would be setting aside a run of their finest posts, turned and treated dead to the exact center of every last specification, for the college men to break and bore and bury and weigh however they saw fit to do it. Amos took this in and turned it over. "And supposing they don't hold," he said to her, not to discourage her from the thing, but because it was the plain question a careful man was bound to ask. "Then we'll have paid to learn the truth of it cheap," she answered him without a breath's hesitation, "which is the only kind of truth ever worth the paying for." And she meant it to the bone, though the meaning of it cost her something to carry. for she had gone and staked the whole hard-won standing of her young company on the plain honesty of college men she had never once laid eyes on, and on the performance, in strange ground of a wood that better than half the state still called garbage to her face, and there was not one single thing left for her to do now but turn the posts true and treat them right, and wait out a verdict that had passed entirely and forever beyond her power to control. The college's testing took the better part of a full year to run its course, a good deal longer than she had let herself hope. For the men at Fenwick did not hurry their work for any soul and plainly would not be hurried at it. And they put her posts through hard trials that made her wince a little just to read of them in the letters, driving them and boring them and weighing them wet against dry and burying whole sawn sections of them down in test plots of a dozen different soils and then coming back around to dig at them and read them month upon patient month. All through that long year of waiting, the ordinary trade of the company went on turning over. She added a fourth distinct market to her book almost without trying for it, a landscape and ornamental supplier down at Kesterton, who had seen the finished vineyard posts standing in a row and wanted the very same clean, handsome article for the grounds of the fine new River Bluff houses going up above the town, and that account, small enough at its start, carried a fine premium price and a year-round steadiness that the plain farm trade had never once managed. For the men building themselves mansions above the river did not defer their ornamental fencing in the least when the corn happened to come in cheap at the elevator. And the corn did come in cheap that year and hard again the next, cheaper than it had come into the county in a long stretch of years. And here the whole shape of the county's fortunes began to shift and tilt in a way that would come in time to matter a great deal more than any soul yet living in it could see. A run of genuinely hard seasons pressed down on the farmers. Low elevator prices, meeting a dry, thin summer that curled the yields, and a farmer pressed hard for ready money defers every single expense that he can possibly find a way to defer. And one of the very first things that a pressed farmer defers is the mending and the extending of his fencing. Thorne felt the pinch of it before ever he understood the cause, his post sales slackening off through those lean seasons, his freighted cedar sitting longer and graying in the yard, his treated pine moving slow off the lot. He put the whole of it down to the hard times, which was not wrong as far as it went, and he settled in to wait for the times to turn back around, which was a reasonable enough thing for a merchant to do, and he did not once see, because he had never in his life looked at the one ledger that would have shown it to him, that a real share of the custom quietly draining away from his lot was not deferring its fencing at all. It was driving 4 steady miles out a county road to buy a cheaper post that lasted the longer. From a young company that took the whole of its raw material, free from the very mills whose scrap heaps Emmett Thorne would not have touched with the long end of a barge pole. The word of that moved through the county the exact way that word moves in country places, which is to say it moved slowly, and then all at once. By the 4th spring, Winnie could count 17 separate men buying regular from her, who had bought from Thorne before her, and she knew the number stood at 17, because she had made a settled practice of asking every new customer, plain, where it was he had traded before he came out to her gate, and she wrote every answer down, not to gloat over it, but because a business that does not know where its own trade is coming from does not truly know where that trade may go tomorrow. The farmers who left Thorne's long counter for her creek bottom yard did not make any speech of it, to him or to anyone. They did not think of themselves for one moment as parties to any grand contest between the young woman out on the water and the old man on the south edge of town. They made a plain, cold economic choice, the very choice a careful man makes with his own hard money in a lean year. And the choice ran her way because her posts cost the man less at the outset and lasted him the longer in the wet, and no loyalty on earth to an old and familiar supplier long survives that particular arithmetic once a man has stood at his own line fence and watched his neighbor's free cottonwood standing sound and true in the very ground where his own dear cedar had gone soft and black. The college's verdict came home to her in the fall of that fourth year, and it came in the form of a printed bulletin under the full seal of Fenwick, and Winnie read it through standing in the very same posture she had first read Warwick's gray pamphlet years before, turned to the window for the last of the light, entirely unable to make herself sit down. The men at Fenwick had gone and done their hard work without the smallest mercy and without the least favor to her, and they had set down what they had found in the flat, unarguable language of plain measurement. And what they had found and set down was this, that the cottonwood heartwood posts, treated exactly as the Ashford Post Company treated them, matched or bettered the freighted treated pine and the freighted cedar in every single trial the college had thought to run against them, and would, by the college's own careful projection over its own seal, stand and hold the better part of 2 full decades in honest ground. It was there in cold print over the college's name, where any man in the whole state who could read might read it and weigh it. And it turned her posts, overnight and forever, from one stubborn woman's unbacked claim into a documented and certified article of commerce that an engineer could specify by name into his plans, and a railroad could requisition by the carload, and a doubting man at a Grange meeting could no longer simply wave off with the back of his hand and a comfortable laugh. She understood exactly what that printed bulletin was worth to her the very moment she finished reading it, and she understood, too, in the same breath, that it had just swung open a door she had not been entirely certain she wished to walk through. For the buyers that a college seal brings driving up to a supplier's gate are not buyers by the 100, nor even by the 1,000. They are buyers by the full 10,000, and the very largest of them, the one that came looking hard for her, before ever she had finished making up her own mind how she meant to go looking for it, was the railroad. The Rock Prairie and Northern ran its single iron line clean across the north of the county, and the law of the state had lately grown itself a hard set of teeth on a matter the railroads had long been comfortable in shrugging off, which was the fencing of the right-of-way against wandering stock. A railroad that left its line unfenced was answerable now, in hard cash for the cattle and the horses its engines struck in the night, and the answering for them had grown expensive enough that even a railroad, which counted out its every dollar in a cold and a distant and an unfeeling way, had begun to reckon a good stout fence the cheaper of the two evils before it. The Rock Prairie needed fence posts now by the long mile, tens of thousands of them at a stroke, to be set along the whole length of its line through the county and on past it, and its purchasing agent, a brisk, close-shaven man come down from the division offices at Kesterton, had a copy of the Fenwick Bulletin folded into his leather portfolio when he stepped down from his buggy at Winnie's gate, which told her, before ever the man opened his mouth to speak, precisely how it was he had come to be standing there in her yard at all. He named her a figure that made the whole grand vineyard order look small. 12,000 posts, plain and stout and true, every one of them treated dead to the college's certified standard, delivered out to the sidings along the line. On a hard schedule, the railroad itself would set and would not bend by a single day, the entire order to be filled complete inside of 4 months, or else the contract lapsed and the whole of it went straight to a supplier down the line who could and would meet the date. 12,000 posts at 13 cents the piece was a sum of money that would have seemed a plain fever dream to the young woman who had counted something under $100 into a flour tin only 3 years before, and Winnie ran the arithmetic of it in her head while the agent was still talking, and the arithmetic came home to better than $1,500 for the one single contract, more than she had earned across any whole year of her life to that day. The trouble in it, the whole of the trouble, was the date. 12,000 finished posts inside of 4 months was a pace she had never once run at, and was not at all certain in her own heart that the operation as it stood could run at, not with 3 machines and the hands she had on, and most certainly not through the wet cold months, when the bluestone treating slowed near to a crawl. She stood alone in the lane a long while after the agent's buggy had rattled off, and she looked at the low lathe shed and the long drying racks and the ever-renewing mountain of free cores that came to her now, from four directions at once. And she made the hard calculation that a person is called upon to make only a very few times across a whole life. The calculation of whether to stretch out past the safe, proven edge of the thing she had built. To take the railroad's contract and then fail, its hard date was a great deal worse than never taking it up at all. For a railroad that has been failed once does not come back a second time. And the whole story of the failing would travel the length of the same rail line the college's bulletin had just traveled, only running the other way. But to take it up and to make the date, to deliver the full 12,000 complete and on time, was to leap the whole young company clear over the head of every last farm supplier in the county, Emmett Thorne the first among them, and to plant the Ashford name for good and all in a market that no cottonwood post in the history of the trade had ever once been let into. She took it. She took the contract, and she took it because the raw material behind it was free and would never once run short on her, which was the single thing in the whole wide world she never had to lie awake in fear. And because she had learned somewhere across those 4 hard years that the worst risk a person ever runs in a life is not the bold leap that fails, but the leap never taken at all by the one soul who could have made it clean. She hired on 3 more men off the strength of the signed contract, which brought her hands to 8 in all, and she bought a fourth lathe secondhand from a failed shop down the line, and then she went and did the one thing that changed the whole settled character of the Creek Bottom place for good and forever, which was to bring in a small steam engine, a little upright boiler and engine bolted down together on heavy skids, to drive the 4 machines through the wet, dead months when no team of horses alive could keep the old horse-sweep boom turning at the hard pace the railroad's date demanded of her. The steam came dear, and it came trailing its own new dangers and its own constant hungry tending, and on the cold morning the fire was first lit under that boiler, and the belts jumped and came alive, and all 4 lathes stood spinning true at once, faster and steadier by far than any patient team of horses could ever have driven them. Winnie stood in the wide door of the shed she had roofed over with her own seasoned stacked timber and understood, plain, that the small, hopeful creek bottom experiment of 4 springs gone by had become, without her ever quite standing still long enough to decide that it should, a genuine manufactory. They ran that whole winter through as the place had never once run before, the boiler smoking black against the low gray winter sky, and the 4 lathes turning from the first gray light clean through to the dark, and the treating troughs steaming in the hard cold, and the finished cured posts going out to the railroad sidings by the loaded wagon on the exact schedule the agent had set down and signed. There were nights that whole winter that Winnie did not sleep at all for the running arithmetic of it, turning over and over behind her eyes the cords of raw cores, standing against the daily count of finished posts, standing against the shortening tally of days left on the contract, and there were bitter mornings when the treating went slow and stubborn in the deep cold, and she felt the whole grand leap of it tremble and sway under her feet. But the men she had hired on were good and steady men, and Amos Beckett drove the crowded shed floor that winter like a man who had waited the whole of his working life for a thing this well worth the driving of, and the count climbed week upon hard week toward the great number the railroad demanded, and out along the frozen sidings of the rock prairie and northern the posts went down into the iron-hard ground in their long-standing ranks, 12,000 blue-budded cottonwood cores that better than half the county would still, to your face, have sworn on a stack of Bibles could not hold a strand of wire through a single spring thaw. She delivered the last load of them inside the hard date, with 11 full days yet to spare on the contract. And the railroad's draft came back to her in the new year, and it was drawn for the whole of the contracted sum, down to the penny. And she did not sit at the table and read that draft over twice the way she had once read the vineyard draft. For she had grown, across the 4 years, clean past the reading twice of drafts. She entered the figure into the company ledger in her own plain steady hand, and she carried the draft into the bank at Alderton. And on the road home she drove the lettered wagon down along the south edge of town, and past Emmett Thorne's supply house, not slowing the team and not stopping it, only passing by, and through the front window of the place. She could make out the shape of the man himself, standing at his counter in the flat gray winter light, and stacked in the open yard beside the building she could see his freighted cedar and his freighted pine sitting exactly where it had sat too long, graying under the weather. She did not feel triumph exactly in the passing, for triumph is a hot and a hungry thing, and what she felt as she drove on was something else entirely. Something cold and clear and settled and certain. The distance between the thing she was building out on the creek and the thing that man was selling in his lot had grown, across 4 short years, too wide by far for any laugh ever again to bridge it, and the whole county had already begun to walk itself across that widening distance in a steady, patient line, wagon by wagon and custom by custom, and there was not one single thing left on earth that Emmett Thorne could do to call any of them back, because he had never once, in all his 22 comfortable years, troubled himself to learn to see the thing that was quietly taking them away. The 5th year opened under a hard high sky that simply would not give down its rain, and the drought that came down and settled over Calder County that whole long season did the thing that droughts have always done, which is to sort out the strong from the weak with a slow thoroughness that no market in the world has ever quite managed on its own. The corn came up thin in the dust, and it stayed thin, curling and going pale in the field by the middle of summer, and the farmers, who leaned their whole year on it, drew their belts in a notch and then drew them in again. And money that had moved freely enough, hand to hand through the county in the wet good years, now scarcely moved through it at all. Yet the drought struck Winnie Ashford's operation very nearly not at all, and the reason that it did not was the very reason her father had never quite let himself believe, and the reason Emmett Thorne had never once in his life stopped to consider, which was that her raw material grew scarce and grew dear for no man, in no season, under no sky. The mills went on, peeling their logs down to the core, whatever the dry sky did overhead, and the cores came off the lathes in their thousands, whatever the poor corn did in the field, and the loaded wagons rolled up her lane free of any charge all through the driest and the dustiest weeks of that hard summer, exactly the way they had rolled up it through the wettest springs behind her. Thorne was not so well placed to weather it, not at all. The same drought that thinned the standing corn also thinned the freight the railroads found to haul, and a railroad that hauls the less will charge the more for every ton of what little it does haul. And so the cedar Emmett Thorne, freighted down from the far north woods, now came to his lot at a rate that lifted his own bare cost on every single post, before ever he set one of them out for sale. He raised his prices because he had no other choice left open to him, better than a full fifth on the plain posts, and he raised them straight into the teeth of a pockets than it had carried in a hard handful of years, which is the very cruelest arithmetic a merchant can ever be handed, to be forced against his will to charge the more in the one season his customers can pay the least. Winnie's prices did not move by a single penny. They did not move because the thing that stood underneath them did not move, her own cost being exactly what it had been from the very first Tuesday of the whole affair, which was next to nothing at all. And a merchant whose cost cannot be made to rise is a merchant that no drought on earth can find the way to squeeze. She watched the great shift come on all through that dry summer. Plain in the ledger, she kept as faithful as Scripture. Her own farm trade slackened, sure enough. For a farmer standing over a dying corn crop fences nothing on his place that he can find any way to put off till a better year. But the slackening was a slight one, 8 in the 100 by her own careful count, and the reason it was slight was that the trade she had spent 5 years building, no longer stood balanced on the single leg of the farmer alone. The vineyards at Millbrook did not defer their trellising for want of rain on the far-off corn ground, for the wine sold on in the diocese whatever the field crops did in the dust. The river bluff builders down at Kesterton did not stop their ornamental fencing because a dry summer had come to the county. For the men who build themselves mansions above a river are not, as a rule, the men that a drought reaches first. And the railroad went on, fencing its long lines straight through the whole dry season, because the hard law that compelled it to fence went right on compelling it. Dry year and wet year, all the same to the statute. She had gone and spread the whole weight of her company out across 4 separate trades that did not any of them lean the same way in the same wind. And so when the drought came down and pressed its hardest on the one of them, the other 3 held it up, and the company held, and it held on steady, while all around it in the county, the single-legged trades of lesser men buckled and went down one after another. Thorne's own trade buckled slowly, the particular way a thing buckles that has stood upright a very long time and cannot yet make itself believe that it is truly going down at last. His sales fell off better than a full third across that one dry year, and the cedar he had contracted in order to head of the season sat stacked and graying in his open yard, and the standing accounts he kept with the northern jobber could not now be unmade nor renegotiated, for he had signed and contracted for the wood well before the drought ever showed itself, and he owed the man for it, whether one stick of it sold off his lot or not. A man who builds his trade on what another and a distant man controls has bought that other man's every trouble along with his goods, whether he ever reads that clause in the bargain or not. And Emmett Thorne had bought himself a whole long season of a distant mill's rising costs and a distant railroad's rising freight. And now the season had turned hard against him, and he could not hand $1 of it back. He stood at his own long counter through that whole dry summer and watched farmers he had sold posts and wire to for 20 years. And more walked their wagons past his window in the dust, and some of them, he came slowly and bitterly to understand, were not walking past him because they had no money left in their pockets for posts. They were walking past his door because they were driving on 4 more miles out a dusty county road to buy their posts cheaper and better than any he could now offer them. From the very young company he had stood up and laughed to open scorn in the Grange Hall. 5 springs gone by. He learned the whole shape of it in the very worst way that a proud man ever learns a hard thing, which is to say he learned it in pieces, and he learned it secondhand, from the mouths of other men. A traveling drummer let it fall, meaning only to be helpful over a glass, that the Ashford Post Company, out on the creek, was quoting a price down the line that he, Thorne, could not hope to touch, and backing that price besides with a Fenwick College bulletin that no other post in the whole state could lay on the counter beside its own. A near neighbor said it to him plainer still, over coffee at the hotel, that his own grown boy had fenced the entire home place with cottonwood posts, hauled out of Elder Creek, and meant to fence the rest of the quarter the very same way the moment he laid hands on the cash for it. The county spoke the name of Winnie Ashford now, up and down its roads, not as a curiosity any longer, nor as a strange girl's amusing little experiment, but as a plain-going concern, a solid name, a careful man reached for by habit the moment he reached for a fence post at all. And Emmett Thorne heard it spoken so, again and again through that long dry summer, until the endless hearing of it wore clean through the last thin, comfortable layer of the certainty that had carried the man easily along for 22 untroubled years. The posts she had sold in her first hard seasons were 5 and 6 years down in the ground by that dry summer, and this one plain fact, more than any printed college bulletin and more than any cut price, was the thing that finally finished the whole long argument for good. A man who had bought his first 11 posts, only to prove the woman wrong and be shut of her, had gone on to fence his whole place on the strength of 11 that would not rot. A man who had leaned on his own line fence and watched his neighbor's free cottonwood stand sound and firm in the very wet ground where his own dear-bought cedar had gone soft, And Punky did not need any college in the state to stand up and tell him the thing his own two eyes had already told him plain across the wire. The ground had rendered up its verdict, slow and sure, and entirely without appeal to any higher court, in a full 100 scattered fence lines across the whole face of the county, and the verdict read the very same in every last one of them. And it could not now be laughed down in any hall, for the men who once would have done the laughing were the very men whose fences it had gone and quietly saved. Winnie felt the great change come less as any triumph than as a settling weight across her shoulders. For a company that better than half a county has come to lean its fortunes on is a company that can no longer afford to fail even a little. She lay awake some nights that summer, not over whether the trade would keep on coming, for the trade came in now faster than she could always fill it, but over the plain question of what she truly owed to the men who had staked their own fence lines and their own hard money on nothing more than her given word. She had 13 hands on now through the busy months, with whole families standing behind every one of them. And the boiler wanted its constant feeding, and the cores wanted their turning, and the drafts wanted their meeting on the day, and the girl who had once counted something under $100 into a flour tin behind the pantry door was gone entirely, and in her place there stood a grown woman who signed for whole freight cars and met a railroad's hard schedule to the day and carried, without ever letting much of it show on her face, the particular kind of load that bends and breaks a person who was not built from the first to bear it. She was built to bear it. She had been built to bear it. She thought to herself sometimes in the small hours. Since the frozen February afternoon she stood, reading a gray pamphlet at a Grange Hall window and understood, before any other living soul in the whole county, that the entire trade had been throwing away the best wood in the tree. It was into the middle of all of this, at the very tag end of that long, dry summer, that Emmett Thorne at last came out to her. He came the way she had half known for years that he would someday have to come, unannounced and unheralded, driving his buggy up her lane in the full middle of a working morning. And she saw the rig turn in at the gate from where she stood in the wide shed door. And she knew the stooped set of the man riding in it before ever she could make out the features of his face. She did not go down to meet him. She finished truing the post, turning on the second lathe, and brought it off the machine clean and straight, and set it careful on the drying rack alongside its fellows. And only then did she wipe her permanently blue-stained hands down the front of her work apron and step out into the hard, bright sunlight of the yard where he had stopped his buggy and sat looking the place over. She let the man look his fill. There was a very great deal in that yard now to be looked at. 4 lathes turning steady off the singing steam, belts, and Amos Beckett and the hands moving through the work of it with the unhurried, certain speed of men who know their trade down to the bone, and the treating troughs standing and steaming, and the long ranks of finished cured posts standing off toward the creek by the Plain Thousand, and the delivery wagon with her own name lettered clean and black and permanent down the side of it. A man could read a whole young company's complete and final answer to a 5-year-old laugh in the sight of that busy yard, if only he had come at last with the eyes in his head to read it. And Emmett Thorne had come at the very last with exactly those eyes. He climbed down from the buggy slow, favoring his years. He was grayer by far than she carried him in her memory from the Grange Hall. And the easy, flat certainty that had filled the whole frame of the man that April night had gone clean out of him somewhere across the 5 hard years between, so that he stood there in her bright yard a plainly smaller man than the one who had laughed her down in front of the county, though he stood not 1 inch shorter than he ever had. He looked a long while at the 4 turning lathes before ever he brought his eyes around to her. "You've built something out here," he said, and there was no laugh anywhere left in the whole of it now. None at all. Only a flat, plain acknowledgement of a fact that seemed to cost the man real coin to lay down. "Yes," she said. She did not soften the one word for him. She had learned somewhere across the 5 years that a plain truth does not need any softening, and that the softening of a truth is very nearly always done for the private comfort of the person who most needs to be made to sit with it hard and whole. He turned his hat slowly around in his two hands, the exact unconscious way Alden Fry had turned his that first far-off spring at her gate, and she marked the likeness of it privately and said not a word of it aloud. "I've come out to talk with you about carrying your posts," he said. "On my lot. Down in the town." She let that sit in the warm air between the two of them a long moment. Not to punish the man with the silence, though the whole county would have forgiven her a little punishing, but because the moment itself had earned its silence honestly, and she would not cheapen the thing by rushing across it. "Do you remember, Mr. Thorne," she said to him at last, level and quiet, "what it was you told me at the Grange? 5 springs back, now. The night I stood up and laid the whole of it out before the room." His rough hands went still on the brim of his hat. He remembered. She could see plainly in his weathered face that he remembered every word of it, that he had perhaps been remembering little else across the whole 4-mile drive out to her gate. "You told me I would turn out a great long stack of posts and stand right there beside them and watch them not sell." She held the man's eyes steady while she said it back to him, level, without a spark of heat in it. "You told me that cottonwood rots. 6 years, you said to me. 8, if the good Lord happened to be smiling." I did. His voice had gone rough in his throat. "I said the whole of that, every word." "You were right about the cottonwood," she said, and she watched a plain surprise cross the man's face, that she would stand there and grant him even so much as that. "The sapwood rots. It rots out just exactly the way you stood up and said it would. 6 years, 8 at the very most. You were dead right about the only cottonwood any man in that whole room had ever once thought to try to use." She let a single beat of silence fall between them. "You were wrong about the heart of it. And you were wrong, Mr. Thorne, about the market." He opened his mouth to answer that, but she was not finished with him yet, and she did not yield him the ground. "The market was never once wrong in the whole affair. That's the part of it I would have you carry away from here, understanding, if you understand nothing else, you drove all this way out to here. The market was trying to tell you a plain thing the entire time, for years on years, and you would not bring yourself to hear it. It was telling you that a farmer wants a post that lasts him the longer and costs him the less, and that he will drive his wagon straight past any friend he has in the county to lay his hands on it. Because a fence line is not friendship, Mr. Thorne. A fence line is money set down in the ground." She lifted her blue hand and gestured, not sharp, out toward the long-standing ranks of posts off toward the water. "I did not invent one single thing in all of this. I did not outsmart a living soul. I only walked over and picked up the thing the whole trade was throwing away by the mountain. And I asked it plainly why it was being thrown away. And the trade never once had a good answer to give me, because there never was one to give." Thorne stood there in the yard with his hat in his still hands and took the whole of it, every word, and to his own lasting credit the man did not once try to argue it back at her. For the busy yard standing all around, the two of them argued a great deal louder than any words he had left to own. "I know it," he said at the last, low and rough. "I have known it a while now, if I'm to be honest with you. I knew the whole of it before ever I drove out here this morning. I only never had the—" He stopped and searched a moment for the word. "I never had it in me to drive out and say it to your face, till this drought came and took the choosing clean away from me." She could have let it end right there. A smaller victory in a smaller soul would have let it end there, would have savored the plain sight of the proud man standing humbled and hat in hand in her yard, and would have sent him back down the road to town with his tail tucked. But Winnie Ashford had never once, from the first Tuesday of it, been in this thing for the humbling of Emmett Thorne. And the words she said to the man next were the truest words she said to him that whole morning. And they were not said to wound him. "The trouble was never that cottonwood is somehow better than pine, Mr. Thorne. It isn't. Cottonwood is not better than pine. The trouble, the whole of it, was that you built your entire trade across 22 years on a wood you had to buy, from a man you had never once laid eyes on, freighted to you over an iron rail you did not own a foot of, at a price the two of them set between themselves, and you simply paid. Any trade a man builds up that way needs only one bad year to break it clean in half. One drought, one freight man's whim, one single season the mill up north decides between breakfast and dinner to charge you double for the same wood. She looked a long moment at the ever-renewing mountain of free cores standing at the edge of her yard, and then she brought her eyes back to his. I do not have that one bad year standing out in front of me anywhere, Mr. Thorne. You do. You have had it standing out in front of you for 22 years running, and you could never once see it there, for the plain reason that it had not yet come. I know that too, the man said, and the saying of it seemed to press the last held breath clean out of him. Some final reserve of the confident man who had once held easy court at the end of the second row. That is the whole reason I am standing in your yard this morning, Miss Ashford, and not in my own. They talked the better part of an hour after that, the two of them standing out in the warm morning sun, with the lathes singing steady behind them. And they did not reach any bargain between them that morning. But they began the long, careful talk that would in its own time become one. What came of it, across the weeks that followed, was not a warm thing, and it was never once meant by either of them to become one. She agreed in the end to supply his lot in town with 200 posts a month, at a price set below her standing wholesale rate, but well and safely above her own bare cost, so that the man had a working margin he could live and trade on, and so that she gained a face and a presence for her goods in the county town without the daily bother of keeping a retail store of her own. It was a plain functional arrangement, struck between two people who had no earthly reason left to be fond of one another, and every good practical reason to be useful to one another. And both of them understood it clear-eyed, for exactly the cold thing it was, and there was a certain hard honesty in that clarity, which a false and a pasted-on warmth would only have gone and spoiled between them. She told the man one thing plain and flat before ever they shook hands to close it, and she told it to him standing, so that there could be no mistaking of it between them a year on down the road. Some of the men who buy their posts from you will stand at your counter and ask you where it is the posts have come from, she said to him, and you will tell them, because whatever else you have been in this affair, Mr. Thorne, you are not a liar. And some of those men, once you have told them, will drive straight on out here to my gate and buy the same posts direct off me, to save themselves the few cents your margin costs them the piece. I will not turn a one of them away when they come. I want that plainly understood between us before ever we start, so that you do not come driving back out here sore about it a year from now. I am not about to go and build a wall around my own trade to stand and protect yours. He took that too without a flinch, for he had no ground left anywhere under him to stand on and refuse it, and he knew that he had none. I wouldn't ask you to, he said, and whether that was a real grace in the man at the last, or only the plain cold recognition that he held no leverage on this earth to ask for anything otherwise, she did not trouble herself to sort out, for it made not the least difference to the bargain either way it fell. He put his first order in with her, that same week, 200 posts, and he set a small hand-lettered sign up in the front window of his supply house that named the Ashford Post Company among the goods he carried, and whether that little sign spoke a genuine and a hard-won pride in the man, or only the plain shrewd sense of a merchant grown willing at last to sell the county the one thing the county had made up its mind it wanted, she left entirely to Emmett Thorne himself to know. She had stopped needing the man to admire her a very long while, before ever he drove out to her gate to say that at last he did. The years that came on after that one did not roar in. They did not need to roar. A company built up the patient way that Winnie Ashford had built hers, grows the way a good hardwood tree grows, without any spectacle in it at all, laying on its one new ring, in its own quiet time a season at a stretch. And the growth of such a thing is the growth of a thing that cannot easily ever be undone again. Because the two great forces that reach up and undo the most of companies had no purchase anywhere to lay hold of on this one. Her cost of raw material did not rise on her across the years. for it already stood at the very bottom it could stand at nothing. And a cost that already stands at nothing can neither be cut beneath a rival nor climb against its owner. And her demand did not swing wildly on her with the seasons. For a fence post is simply not a thing that a working man buys in an armful when he feels flush and forgoes entirely when he feels poor. He buys it when he needs it, in the dry year and the wet year all the same, and if the last post he bought and set outlasted his neighbors at half again the price, he goes back and buys the very same again, without a second thought in his head. She was not out selling a luxury that a hard season could talk a careful man back out of wanting. She was selling a plain necessary thing that no working farm on earth could do without, for long, at a price no rival in the trade could hope to meet. Backed by a printed proof no rival could lay on the counter beside it, and a trade built up square and solid, on those three legs at once, does not fall down. By the seventh spring, the company kept 14 hands on through the whole of the busy season, and it had grown a name that traveled far out past the bounds of the county on the same rail line, down which the mills first talk of. The strange girl and the free cores had once traveled. She was asked that seventh year to come and speak at the State Grange meeting over at Whitcomb, before a full hall of farmers and suppliers and college men gathered in from clear across the state, and the asking of it was a thing she turned over privately in her mind across some days before ever she sent back her answer. For she was not a woman who went out hunting after a platform to stand on, and the last hall she had risen to her feet in had laughed her back down into her chair. She went. She went in the end because the one plain thing she had it in her to say was a thing worth the saying aloud. Not for her own account, for her own account was long since settled in the black, but for the account of every farmer sitting in that hall, who was even then buying his goods without the first idea of it, from a trade built up the very same fragile way that Emmett Thorne had built his, on a wood the man did not control, at a price the man could not govern, freighted over a rail the man did not own. She did not stand up at Whitcomb and tell the assembled hall the long story of her own company, for the story of any one company is a dull enough thing to a hall, full of strangers who did not live a day of it. She told them, instead, the one hard thing she had learned across the 7 years that was truly worth another soul's hearing, and she told it to them plain and without ornament. There is a fortune lying right now in the waste heap behind every single trade in this whole country, she said to the hall, and the great room went quiet, in a different way entirely than the Grange Hall had once gone quiet at the sound of her, and the one and only reason that fortune goes on lying there, untouched, is that the men already in the trade have agreed among themselves, quietly and completely, never once to walk back there and look hard at it. They have agreed together that the thing they throw away is worthless, and they have agreed it so long and so completely and so comfortably that not one man among them ever thinks to go back and test whether the thing they all agreed on is even true. I did not have a single gift that those men lacked. I had no money they lacked, and no schooling they lacked, and no quicker turn of mind than any of theirs. I had one plain habit, and the whole of the habit was this. When the entire trade stood up as one man and told me that a thing had no value in it, I asked them, every time, to prove it to me. And not one time in 7 years could a one of them ever do it. She let the whole of that settle down over the silent hall. The single most valuable thing standing in any business in this country is the very thing that everyone in it has already agreed to call worthless. Go home from here, every one of you, and go and look hard at your own waste heap. There is a whole company lying in it. If only you have got the plain nerve to walk back there and pick the stuff up in your 2 hands and ask it out loud why it was that nobody else ever wanted it. The hall did not laugh at her. A great many of the men who sat in it that day went home to their own places and walked out back and looked, for the first time in their lives, hard at their own waste heaps, and a few of them, in the quiet years that followed, went on to build up solid things of their own out of whatever it was they found lying back there forgotten. And some of those men later sat down and wrote to her about it, and she kept every one of the letters they sent in a drawer of the desk. She had come in 7 turning years from a young woman laughed, clean out of a country Grange hall, to a woman that a full state hall fell silent to hear speak, and the true distance that she had traveled across those years was not a distance that could be measured out in the money standing in her account at the bank, though the money was real enough and hard-earned besides. It was measured in the one plain fact that the very people who had once known so much better than to sit and listen to a word she said now knew a great deal better than to speak a word over her while she was saying it. She drove home alone from Whitcomb, exactly as she had once driven home. Alone, from the Grange of the Black Knight, Emmett Thorne laughed her down, and the whole difference in the world between those 2 long drives was the entire story of the 7 years laid end to end, though she did not dwell on it as she drove, for she was not a woman ever much given to the dwelling. Her father was failing a little that 7th spring, slowing at his work in the way of a man come up on 60, who has farmed the same ground since he was a boy, and he had begun to lean on her judgment in small ways he would never once have found the words to name aloud. Taking her word now on a question of the corn ground, asking her plain opinion on a matter of the farm the very way he had once, across a lamplit table, given his hard opinion on hers. The honest lease she paid him every year for the use of the creek acres had grown to be a real and a load-bearing part of what carried the old man and his corn through the lean elevator years. And he had never once in all the years said a word of thanks to her for it, and she had never once wanted him to say it, for it was not that kind of thing that stood between the two of them, and both of them knew to the bone precisely what it was without ever needing to lay a name to it. There came an evening late in that 7th spring, the creek running low and clear over its stones under a sky, washing slowly over from rose to a deep and settling slate, that Winnie walked down the length of her own lane alone. She had not set out to do it. She had come out of the shed at the close of the day's long run, with the boiler banked down for the night and the belts gone still, and the last of the hands driven off home to their suppers, and her own feet had simply carried her on down the drive, without her ever quite deciding that they should, down toward the line of posts she had set into the ground there in her first hopeful summer, the rough, early, crooked work of her own 2 hands that she had tamped home and promised herself she would walk and watch. She had walked that line every single spring for 7 years running now, and every spring it had told her a little more of what it knew, and she walked it now in the settling quiet, with the swifts cutting and wheeling through the last of the rose light above the water. The posts stood, 7 full years down in the ground now, the roughest and the earliest and the most crooked she had ever turned off the horse sweep in her life. Cottonwood heartwood that better than half the county had once swoon on their fathers' graves could not last a single season in the wet, and they stood as true and as sound as the very day she had set them. She took the nearest of them in both her hands, exactly the way she had taken it that first anxious thawing spring, and she rocked it hard against its footing, and it did not give. She moved on down the standing line and took the next post, and then the next past it, and not a one of them gave under her hands. Not one had gone soft down at the ground. Along its length the slow black sponge rot that every farmer in Calder County knew by heart from a lifetime of cottonwood, and that Emmett Thorne had stood up Steuben a full haul and promised the whole county would take them inside of 6 short years. The ground had rendered up its final verdict on the whole long affair, in its own slow and its own honest time, and the verdict it gave was the very one she had first read in a gray college pamphlet at a Grange window, when she was but 22 and had gone home and staked 8 acres of her father's creek bottom and the whole of his hard-won trust and 7 years of her one life upon, and the ground had gone and made it good. She stood at the far end of the line a long while, in the last of the failing light, her blue-stained hands come to rest on the head of the final post, and she did not weep over it, and she did not speak a word into the quiet, and she did not try to turn the plain moment into anything at all larger than the thing it honestly was. It was only a fence line that had not rotted, It was only the thing she had said at 3:20 against the laughing hall would come quietly to pass at the last. In the slow and the honest and the unhurried time of the ground, which does not hurry itself for any living soul's belief, and does not delay itself by an hour for any living soul's doubt. She let her hand rest there on the sound hard wood until the rose had gone clean out of the sky and the slate had deepened toward the first of the dark, feeling under her blue palm the plain unspectacular soundness of a thing done right and proven true at the last by the one and only judge in all the world whose verdict could never be argued with, nor bought, nor hurried, nor laughed away. Then she took her hand down from the post, and she turned back up the length of the darkening lane toward the low shape of the shed where the cooling machines stood, waiting silent in their ranks, and where the lathes stood ready. Come the morning, to run again.